Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here on the channel. It's great to see old friends. And if you're new, welcome to the channel. My name is Ursula Bielski. I am an author, historian, folklorist, and paranormal researcher. And I talk about all things supernatural. And today we are talking about a very interesting subject. We're talking about uh, supernatural and paranormal experiences of the troops in World War One, in no man's land, the Western Front. And I got interested in this subject a few weeks ago when my husband and I saw the new Netflix made version of All Quiet on the Western Front, the classic novel of World War One. And first of all, I highly recommend that you see this version of the film. The original was great, of course, but honestly, some of the best acting I've ever seen. And, um, the novel is amazing and it really portrays just the absolute horror of World War One. And this film really captures that horror. It's really something to see. So, again, highly recommend that you check out All Quiet on the Western Front on Netflix. But today I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the different experiences that the troops had in fighting World War One on the Western Front. This was such a terrible, terrible war and such a pointless war. And it really is something I think it's good for us to remember what World War One was like and what these troops went through on the battlefield in no man's land. It was truly a horrific, dehumanizing experience, and again, really good for us to remember. And I think a lot of these experiences that these troops had really kind of sum that up too. And some historians have come to see, who don't believe in the reality of these experiences that these men have though come to really appreciate the symbolic value also of a lot of these experiences that really sum up the horror of going through the fighting of World War One. So let's start actually with, probably the most infamous experience that these soldiers had during the war with the paranormal, and that was the legend of the Angel of Mons. This was a bizarre experience that many, many soldiers claim to have experienced as they were fighting the war in Belgium. And let me tell you a little bit about what was happening there. So on August 23rd, 1914, this was less than a month after the beginning of the First World War, Germans had swept through most of Belgium and were now approaching France. The British had 70,000 troops and had arrived in France a week earlier, and they were already absolutely exhausted, beleaguered, beaten down. But they continued their resistance against the Germans in the fields of Mons in Belgium. It seemed inescapable that the Germans were going to absolutely annihilate them. The Germans had more than twice as many troops, and they were just pummeling them. Somehow, however, the British managed to escape and continue their so-called Great Retreat to the Marne. The Germans, on the morning of August 23rd, were led by General Alexander von Kluck, and he and his 150,000 soldiers attacked the British positions. The German army suffered heavy losses from British rifle fire, but and at that point, General John French was forced to instruct his outnumbered forces to retreat. He favored a withdrawal to the coast, but the British War Minister, Lord Kitchener, ordered the British Expeditionary Force to retreat to the River Marne, fighting the whole way. One historian, James Hayward, pointed out that these men, he said, quoting him, faced a grueling ordeal of long forced marches south on unmade or rough cobbled roads with little food or rest, interspersed with fierce rearguard actions to hold off the relentless advance of the Germans. On August 26th, General Horace Smith Dorrien ordered the British to engage the Germans at La Cateau. The British managed to inflict heavy casualties on the German troops, but also suffered terrible losses themselves, with almost 8,000 of their troops killed out of about 40,000 men taking part in the battle. That evening, General French ordered the retreat to continue. Now, over the next few days, many soldiers recorded seeing mysterious visions. One young officer said, "I saw all sorts of things on the road, including enormous men walking towards me and strange lights." A lieutenant colonel would remember later that, quote, "On the night of the 27th of August, I was riding along in the column with two other officers. We had been talking and doing our best to keep from falling asleep on our horses. As we rode along, I became conscious of the fact that in the fields, on both sides of the road along which we were marching, I could see a very large body of horsemen. These horsemen had the appearance of squadrons of cavalry, and they seemed to be riding across the fields and going in the same direction as we were going and keeping level with us. I did not say a word about it at first, but I watched them for about 20 minutes. The other two officers had stopped talking, I noticed. At last, one of them asked me if I saw anything in the fields. I told them what I had seen. The third officer then confessed that he too had been watching these horsemen for the last 20 minutes. So convinced were we that they were real cavalry that at the next halt, one of the officers took a party of them out to reconnoiter, but found no one there. The night grew darker and we saw no more. So that was one pretty interesting experience that has become repeated a lot about what these men were starting to see. Lance Corporal Johnston also talked later about what he had seen on the retreat from La Cateau. He says, "We had almost reached the end of the retreat, and after marching a whole day and night with but 1/2 hour's rest in between, we found ourselves near Paris just at dawn. And as the day broke, we saw in front of us large bodies of cavalry and big men on massive chargers. I remember turning to my chums in the ranks and saying, 'Thank God we're not far from Paris now. Look, the French cavalry.' They too saw them quite plainly, but on getting closer, to our surprise, the horsemen vanished and gave place to banks of white mist with clumps of trees and bushes dimly showing through." So another second experience from one of the men on the field, several of the men on the field together. On September 5th, 1914, Brigadier General John Charteris reported that one particular vision, which had become known as the Angel of Mons, was spreading through the Second Corps. The story said that the Angel of the Lord on the traditional white horse had appeared, clad in white and holding a flaming sword, facing the advancing Germans at Mons and forbidding their further progress. Backing up these reports, in 1915, another officer told the paranormal journal called Light that, quote, "a curious phenomenon had been witnessed by several officers and men at Mons. It took the form of a strange cloud interposed between the Germans and the British," the officer said. "This cloud," he said, "had the effect of protecting the British from the enemy." So yet another story of many men witnessing this cloud of figures, angels, beings, that was forming some sort of barrier between the British and the French and the Germans, actually preventing the Germans from advancing on the battlefield. The story also appeared in 1915 in a magazine called All Saints Parish magazine. It was reported in this magazine that two junior officers had talked about what they'd seen on the retreat from Mons. Quote, "Both of them had themselves seen the angels who saved their left wing from the Germans when they came right upon them during the retreat from Mons." One of them, who was noted to be not a religious man, said that he saw a troop of angels between the British and the Germans. The other man and his company were retreating, and they heard the German cavalry tearing after them. They turned around to face the enemy, expecting instant death, when to their wonder, they saw between them and the enemy a whole troop of angels again. The German horses turned round terrified and stampeded. The men tugged at their bridles while the poor beasts tore away in every direction. So stories of the Germans actually experiencing this too and interacting with it. Now, many historians believe that the story of the Angel of Mons, which has become such a famous story in the supernatural tales of the First World War, probably came from an invented ghost story that was written by a very popular author at the time named Arthur Machen, that was published in the Evening News. I guess this was in London in September of 1914. By the next year, it was also included in a popular book that sold like 100,000 copies. Machen came to believe that it was his story that these soldiers were somehow remembering as something that had actually happened to him. And he was angered by it. And he felt that religious-minded people were exploiting his story, for this bizarre end, which he felt was a very, uncool thing to be happening. There were a number of veterans who agreed with Machen. They said, we were going through hell. We were completely exhausted. We were ill. We were injured. We were writing for days on end with like maybe an hour of sleep. We were absolutely seeing things. We were absolutely having hallucinations. We were babbling with delirium. And yet, how do you explain how so many of us saw the same thing, in different companies, in different places? We experienced the same thing, and we all described it the same way. And even Machen, the author, was quick to point out that he had never used the word angel in his short story, yet all of these men did. So as this one vet said, quote, "It is an extraordinary thing that the same phenomenon should be witnessed by so many different people. I myself am absolutely convinced that I saw these horsemen, and I feel sure that they did not exist in my imagination. I did not attempt to explain the mystery. I only state facts." So the mystery of the Angel of Mons will probably remain a mystery forever, and yet you can't really get around the fact that so many of these vets experienced, as this one vet said, the exact same vision, hallucination, or experience, whatever you would like to call it, despite this story that was written, that was similar and was invented. So it continues to be a mystery, and again, probably the most famous supernatural story of World War I. These kinds of visions, however, continued, and they seemed to escalate after the poison gas attacks began in 1915. There was one engineer that had served at Ypres in Belgium, who later said that he and his fellow soldiers had one day looked out over no man's land and saw a strange gray cloud rolling towards them. This was one of the first poison gas clouds that had been unleashed by the Germans. And what happened next, he said, it was like in a dream. He said a figure emerged from this cloud of gas wearing the uniform of the Royal Army Medical Corps. The figure, he said, had a belt on, and on the belt were a number of hooks, and hanging from the hooks were these little tin cups. And the figure was carrying a bucket with something that looked like water inside. And this figure spoke to the men in the trenches, and it started dipping out liquid from this bucket and giving these tin cups of liquid to the men and saying, "Drink it fast, hurry, drink it." And they drank this liquid, and they said it looked like water, but it was extremely salty, so salty that they almost couldn't swallow it. This was an amazing, miraculously seeming story. After the cloud of gas dissipated, none of the soldiers who had drunk this liquid from this mysterious figure um, got sick from the gas, and none of them retained any physical injuries from the gas. And yet, thousands of troops who had not drunk this liquid died from the gas or suffered temporary or even permanent injury for the rest of their lives. So, very strange event of this mysterious figure at Ypres. There was also a sort of miraculous tale that came out of France in the town of Albert. The story of the so-called leaning virgin of Albert is one that's still told around France and by historians of the First World War today. And here's how the story goes. When the French town of Albert's basilica was shelled by the Germans in January of 1915, a statue of the Virgin Mary on its bell tower was damaged, but it didn't fall. It lay in kind of suspended in this almost horizontal position, just ready to fall at any moment. And the British were very superstitious, the British that were in the town with the war effort. And they immediately concocted this superstitious belief that if this statue of the Virgin fell, they would lose the war. And so they set about desperately trying to protect the statue from falling. And they rigged it up with cables and things like this. Well, the Germans got wind of this superstition, what the British believed. So they began this effort, constantly shelling and bombing the church, trying to bring the statue down. But it didn't work. And it was actually not until almost the end of the war that the statue did come down, but it was accidental. It was accidental shelling by the British that brought it down. But just a couple months later, the war ended, of course, in the Allies' favor. And after the war, the church was restored and a replica of the statue was put back up on the bell tower where it watches over the town of Albert even today. And that story of the Leaning Virgin still goes on today as well. Well, of course, wouldn't be a war without ghost stories, right? And there are some really interesting ghost stories related to World War One. One of them was a story of a Scottish air base, which was at Montrose in Scotland. And this was an air base that was established in February of 1913 by the Royal Flying Corps, which later became the RAF. And it was the first military aerodrome in the United Kingdom. One of the Irish pilots that was based there was a man named Lieutenant Desmond Arthur. He died when his plane crashed in May of 1913. Afterwards, throughout the First World War, his ghost was reputed to haunt the officers' mess. The official investigation of the crash reported that Arthur was, quote, killed by his own foolishness. And it was very interesting because Arthur had died sometime before, but the hauntings didn't begin until this derogatory report was released. And his buddies came to believe that this was why he came back, because he was angry about this report. Well, sure enough, there was a second report, or second inquiry that was opened into the crash. And the second inquiry found that Arthur's plane had been in need of repair, and it wasn't his fault. And after this second report came out, you guessed it, the sightings stopped. Well, some of our ghost stories come from these great poets of World War I. You know, some of the greatest poets in Western civilization came out of World War I. Robert Graves was one of these, and he served as a captain in the British Army during the war. His poem, Corporal Stare, is a ghost story of sorts set in Bethune. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Bethune, France, during World War I. He always claimed that the story was true, even though he wrote a poem about it. And he said that one summer night, he and his fellow men had a rare night off, and they were celebrating with feasting and drinking in this little French town. They were having a rollicking good time with this meal when, in the middle of it, Graves looked up and he saw one of the British privates at the window. The private smiled, saluted, and then walked out of view. And Graves apparently ran outside and looked all up and down the road, and there was no trace of this guy. the strange thing about this occurrence was that Graves had gotten word that this private had been killed the month before, and yet there was no mistaking in Graves' mind that it was him. The last time Graves had seen the pilot private alive had been back in Britain when they had been training together. And this young man had shaken Graves' hand and said, "I'll meet you again in France, sir." And apparently he did. Another one of the great World War I poets was Rupert Brooke. And while on his way to a fight, Brooke was bitten by a mosquito and died of sepsis. His most famous lines are also probably the most famous lines in the history of the First World War poetry. I'm sure you've heard them before. If I should die, think only this of me, that there is some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. And so those are his words. But another one of his famous poems is called The Old Vicarage, Grantchester. And this was a poem about a house near Cambridge, England, where Brooks had rented rooms in the happier days before the war. Some think that Brooks returned there after the war because there was a book of ghost stories, true ghost stories, that came out in 1936. And the author talked about a time when he was living in that same house where Brooks had spent time, but it was after Brooks's death in 1919. So one chilly night, he was sitting in these rooms, smoking and relaxing, when his dog suddenly sat up and growled at the window. He then heard footsteps walking through the house and even through his own sitting room and towards the French doors. And the next day, when he told about his experience to the owners of the house, they told him that these kinds of things had been going on since Rupert Brooks' death on the battlefield 4 years earlier. Ypres, Belgium, which we already talked about, was one of the bloodiest battle sites of the First World War, with casualties in the hundreds of thousands. Among these seemingly countless dead was a friend of Lieutenant William Spate. In December of 1915, Spate was huddled in his dugout when he was visited by his friend, who had passed away. Just as with Graves, the friend didn't really say much, but he pointed to the ground and then vanished. The next evening, Spate asked a fellow officer to join him in the dugout in case the ghost should come back. They were not disappointed. The dead friend appeared again, pointed again to the spot on the ground, and then vanished. The third night, the ghost appeared yet again, and once again pointed to the floor before disappearing. Spate then ordered his men to dig a hole where the ghost had indicated. They found a small tunnel a few feet down, packed with explosives and rigged to blow in 13 hours. The bombs were deactivated and the men saved by the ghost. These are some famous stories from some famous veterans, but there are so many more of these ghostly accounts that come to us from soldiers' diaries and letters that they wrote to family members. One of the most famous was that of a Canadian soldier named Will Bird, who wrote a book called Ghosts Have Warm Hands. And in it, he recalls how, while sleeping in a dugout one night during the war, he was woken up by someone's warm hands holding his. He opened up his eyes and was shocked to see that it was his brother, who had been killed in action earlier in the war. His brother motioned for him to follow him outside. He did so, but while following him through the forest, his brother vanished. And on his way back to the dugout, Will was shocked to hear an explosion. A German shell had landed right in the dugout where he'd been sleeping, killing 2 of his fellow soldiers. It was then that Will remembered his brother's promise to return and, quote, whisper in his ear if he were to die in the war before him. And Will was absolutely convinced that his brother had come and led him away from the site so that he would not be killed in this shell blast. There was another personal account by a British sergeant major who was manning his post when he saw a former commanding officer walking towards him. The sergeant major was shocked to see that the officer had 2 arms because he knew the colonel had lost an arm in battle just a few days earlier. What he didn't know was that that commanding officer had died on his way to the hospital. And yet he and his whole company of men saw the dead colonel for almost a full minute with two arms before he vanished. Some fascinating story. Kind of in the same area is another very strange legend about World War One, and this is the legend of the ghouls of no man's land. And this is the first of several sort of creatures of the night we're going to look at for a few minutes. The so-called ghouls of no man's land, or wild deserters, kind of took on, I mean, they were a real thing, but they also took on this almost supernatural tinge or aura as the stories were passed around from encampment to encampment, from battlefield to battlefield during the war. And then afterwards, these are far darker stories of these mystical stories of angels and these comforting tales of ghostly visitors. These were accounts of a mysterious band of deserters. These were deserters from every army, apparently except the United States. I've read in several places. And they actually were deserters who were living together in the abandoned trenches and dugouts. And they would emerge at night to steal uniforms and food and weapons from corpses on the battlefield. And there were stories that came out of this, that some of these actually became ghouls, and they would come out at night and actually feast on the flesh of the dead soldiers. Whether this was true, that there was so little food that they resorted to cannibalism of the dead bodies, I don't know. Or if this was a legend that sprung out. But again, this is one of those legends that even historians who don't believe in any reality about this believe that these stories are really perfect symbols of the dehumanization and utter horror and inhumanity of World War One and no man's land. There was another story that came from here, also from Mons, Belgium, known as the Hound of Mons. This was a story that was published only after the war in several American newspapers, and the story had been told by a Canadian vet named Captain F.J. Newhouse. He had related how, while he was in the trenches at Mons, Allied soldiers had been terrorized by this vicious black wolfhound. One night in 1914, he said that a captain had taken 4 men out on patrol in no man's land, and they were found with their throats ripped out the next day. In the days that followed, there were these chilling howls that were heard echoing across the battlefield, and future forays of troops into no man's land were found similarly brutally killed with their throats torn out, as that first group had been. Now, according to the story that was published, a German scientist had been trying to transfer a madman's brain into the head of a Siberian wolfhound in an attempt to create an army of deadly beasts to aid the Germans. Alas, the story could never be proven true, but probably sold a lot of newspapers. But that story of the Hound of Mons still continues today, and you'll still hear it around that area today as part of their local, urban legends, and also related to the supernatural stories of the First World War. There was also, believe it or not, an account of a sea monster during World War One. The British steamer Iberian was cruising off the coast of Ireland when it became engaged in battle with the German sub and received 2 direct hits. The German captain later claimed that he had stood on the sub's conning tower and watched the Allied ship sink. He said about a half minute after it went below the surface, there was an explosion on the ship below the water, which blew this creature into the air out of the water. It was blown so high in the air and hung there long enough for the captain to see that the creature was, he said, about 65 feet long with a crocodile-like shape. So sea monster sighting. He claimed there were 6 other men who saw it too, but They all ended up, I think, dying during the war. So he was the only one who lived who could attest to the reality of what had happened. Um, of course, everyone on the ship, that the Allied ship that was sunk, could not say one way or the other. But yeah, a report of a sea monster. The First World War was also the origin, I guess you would say, of the first X-Files, which, had its origins really in Britain. And these, a special organization that was founded by the British military to investigate unknown aerial objects. I don't know if you guys know this, but I've done a lot of research into UFOs this year. I'm working on a book about that, and I have. It's really fascinating because we all think that the UFO flap started in the 1940s, especially with the Roswell incident and a couple of other sightings. The original flying saucer sighting and that sort of thing. But there were actually a number of bizarre sightings of phantom or unidentified airships in the United States, in different parts of the country in the late 19th century. Some people even claim to have encounters with people on board these airships that essentially didn't exist. I mean, these airships didn't exist, and so nobody really knows if these were hallucinations, delusions, extraterrestrials, some secret government program, or what. So there's a lot of different weird theories about it, but this was a problem. This for the governments that were fighting World War I. This was a problem because they needed to know if something was flying around in the air. They needed to know what it was, and so there was a special organization that was formed. It was a predecessor to MI5, and it was called the Military Observation Department 5, or MO5, and it was under the control of Lieutenant Colonel Kell, and he was assigned the task of classifying sightings in the air. So, amid all this panic about enemy airships, it was an absolute military necessity to weed out any of these unidentified phantom airships from the real aircraft sightings. Nigel Watson is an author of a book called UFOs of the First World War, and he says, quote, during World War I, there were numerous reports of mysterious lights and objects moving about the skies, and these were studied by the Assistant Director of Military Aeronautics, which was a post held by Lieutenant Colonel W.S. Brancker. These two investigators, Brancker and Kell, he says, can really be regarded as the first Mulder and Scully, who were studying UFOs all the way back during World War I. Now, there are a lot of weird stories about flying saucers and UFOs during World War I, but probably the most famous one, and probably the most unsubstantiated one, to be honest, is the claim that Baron Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, shot down a flying saucer during the war. According to the story, which was told by his buddy, another pilot, Peter Waitsrick, they were flying, around during the war, and I'm not quite sure. I want to say this was in France, but I'm not quite positive. And they said they saw an aircraft that looked like an upside down saucer. We were terrified, he said, because we'd never seen anything like it before. The Baron, the Red Baron, immediately opened fire, and the thing went down like a rock, shearing off tree limbs as it crashed into the woods. And he claimed that there were two beings that jumped off this crashed craft and ran into the forest and disappeared. The story is very dubious. There were some issues about, some discrepancies about what kind of planes they were flying and the timing and things like this. But the biggest question mark about this story is that his buddy, Waitsrick, did not bring the story forward until 80 years after it happened. And he said he told his wife and his grandchildren. They verified that, but he never came forward with it. And when he did tell his story, he told it to the Weekly World News. And if you're an American, you know that it's like 1,000 times worse than the National Enquirer. It's like the most unverifiable, unreliable, ridiculous news stories. So whether or not no one else would, listen to him, or maybe he saw that publication in a grocery store and saw that they were reporting on UFOs and maybe they would listen to him or something, maybe it was just an accident that it happened to be that newspaper, or maybe it's just the story isn't true. I don't know, but we'd sure love it to be true that the Red Baron shot down a flying saucer. But who knows? Maybe we'll know someday a little more about it, or maybe it'll be one of the mysteries of the paranormal and supernatural events of World War I. These stories meant a lot to me to read about, especially the ghostly visitations. As some of you may know, one of my first moments, where I became interested in ghosts was as a very young girl, because my mom told me a story about her brother Will, who had gone to fight in World War II. And he had been, he was on the boat going to war when, Pearl Harbor was bombed. And he never came back. He was gone for 4 years. He never came back. He was killed in an airfield explosion on Saipan Island. And my mom told me the story when I was a little girl, that her mom and dad were sleeping in their bedroom after Will had been gone for 4 years. And they woke up one night in the middle of the night, just sat up in bed. And Will, their son, was standing at the foot of the bed in his uniform, smiling at them. And they thought he had come home, and they jumped out of bed and he vanished. And the next day they got a telegram from the War Department telling them that Will had been killed in action on the airfield at almost the moment that they had seen him in their bedroom in Chicago. So that story stuck with me so much when I first heard it as a little girl. And certainly it was a big part of why I became interested in studying ghosts and hauntings and the paranormal. So hearing about a lot of these other stories that these young men had with their brothers and their sons and their brothers and their fellow soldiers in World War I, it took me back to those very early days of my life when my mom first told me that story. And it's a story that I've heard so many times from so many people in similar situations over the years. So they continue to mystify us and comfort us also, I think. So thank you so much for joining me here today to talk about the paranormal and supernatural experiences of World War I. I do hope you check out the Netflix film, All Quiet on the Western Front. Let me know if you watch it, what you think about it, in comments. And certainly if you have any stories about supernatural events of World War I, please let me know about those in the comments also. Before you leave here, if you do me a huge favor, if you could like the video, share it with a friend, share it on social media, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and then ring that notification bell, because whenever I'll put out a new video, you'll know about it right away. Thanks so much for being here with me. It means everything to me. Take good care, and I will see you next time.